Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode. This is very important episode because today we will arrange another debates. Our speakers from our parliament, definitely it's a mock parliament. They get huge popularity, especially we get lot of invitations in Asia Pacific, different parliaments as well as university. They inviting World Talent Economy Forum debaters for arrange show debate. Already we get invitation from International Islamic University Malaysia, as well as Dhaka University Debating Club, United International University Debating Clubs, even IIT Kanpur. They are big fan of our debating activities. Perhaps in the futures, we will see our debaters in the real parliaments. Yes, we are discussing with different parliaments. We will arrange some show debate with some parliamentarians, maybe in the March, because some of the parliament members they ensured that they will join in our debating activities. For today's debate, our topic is very important because climate change is a very interesting issue right now, very important issue right now. On the other hand, we have a lot more challenges. So we have our expert debaters for today's parliament, our Honorable Prime Minister, Professor Rob, Minister of Environment, Professor Donald, from the government side, and we have very powerful Minister of the Parliament, Mr. Marshall. On the other hand, we have, yeah, because last parliament they were in government, because of some of the election issues and some of the challenges in the parliament. For this parliament they go to the opposition side, but they are very strong. Definitely they will fight in this debate, and I'm sure our audience will enjoy. So our opposition leader of the parliament, Professor David Smith, very strong politicians. He has a lot of contribution in technology as well. Beside that, from Transhumanist Party, even though they are very new, but this time they win the elections, and Mr. Jason become the parliament members of the opposition side. So hopefully this debate will be very interesting. So as a speaker of the parliament, I want to start this debate. Beside that, I request everyone, in our parliament, there are many interesting argument and other things, but definitely it's a mock parliament. So nothing serious, but our knowledgeable debaters will add values for the developing world parliament. Professor Rob, as a Prime Minister, you can start.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Our position is that the climate change is the greatest threat facing humanity today. There are a lot of threats facing humanity: meteors, supervolcanoes, artificial intelligence, unknown consequences, synthetic biology, nanotechnology, nuclear war, major asteroid impact, ecological collapse, global system collapse, and bad governance are the top ones that are listed. But they all have one thing, most of them have one thing in common, and that's that they damage the ecosystem. Extreme climate change does massive damage to the ecosystem, and that does mean that if we address the problems with extreme climate change, we also mitigate some of the issues with these other approaching events. We clearly can't field up meteor defense. Super volcanoes exist geographically. We either have them or not. AI is largely being developed outside the country, and all we can do is hope that it doesn't invade. I love unknown consequences because that just means it's unknown and it's going to get you when you're not looking, and I'm not sure there's anything we can do about it. The synthetic biology, the idea that some scientists someplace are going to develop a superbug and wipe us all out. Nanotechnology, small machines that could permeate our world. Nuclear war, we're not a nuclear power at the moment, not advocating we become one, but clearly that too would cause ecological and climate problems. Ecological collapse, which can be caused by extreme climate change, global system collapse, which could be caused by a number of these issues, but also climate change, and of course, finally, bad global governance. That I'm going to leave as the purview to my opposition. The things that we're looking at are more frequent and severe weather as a result of climate change. We're already seeing some of that. Many of us are becoming aware of a new term, aerial having to do with water transport, air rivers that carry large amounts of water into areas that aren't prepared for them. These have hit areas in the United States. Germany, in particular, was in the news just recently for excessive flooding, but it moves all over the world. And whether we're talking about flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, thunderstorms, which cause forest fires, our world has been inundated by these events for quite some time now. As a result of climate change. Higher death rates and lower birth rates are being attributed to global climate change, which means our ability to hold on to people has been reduced. And we now have another term that we're looking at, which are climate refugees, people that are leaving geographies and moving to other geographies because they can't get clean water, food, because violence has gone vertical in their area. And these people, these vast movements of people, if they're coming from us, they lower our ability to actually make goods and farm and do the things we need to do to keep our economy running. A dirtier air due to ground level ozone, the pollution stays closer to the ground, becomes far worse and far more deadly. And here's a case where we believe that this dirty air not only helps cause extreme climate change, it results from extreme climate change. So you have both cause and effect. We get higher wildlife extinction rates. My mouth is still waking up. Extinction rates, and the result is some of that wildlife is stuff we eat and consume as part of our food base. Others are just keeping our ecology balanced. If certain animals die out, then other invasive species get out of hand. Look at Australia and their mice problem at the moment. That appears to be a result, at least a partial result, of climate change. We get more acidic oceans, which means certain types of fish are going to die out. Fish that are our food source are going to die out. We get major algae blooms that cause other animals to die and become sick. Sea levels come up, so we not only get flooding in areas we don't have flooding before. In higher elevations, at lower elevations, they go below sea level, and the end result again is we have flooding, we lose arable land for farming, and once again we have large movements of populations with no place to put them. We get migrating pestilence, pests that are invasive pests that are only live in certain climate areas, in certain areas of warmth, now can live in other areas. The Japanese beetle has become highly mobile, for instance, and it tends to inundate crops and exacerbate the problem. For food, water, both acquiring and transportation are at risk, and they're at risk for a number of the items that I listed, but clearly at risk for climate change. High winds blow over trucks, sink ships. The water it moves from area to area. Floods can cause sewage to roll into and contaminate water sources. And of course, where areas are not getting enough water, that we're getting not only huge fires that result from those very new arid conditions, but we don't have the water we need to supply our citizens. And again, those citizens are then put at risk. And of course, as we lose water, our power sources get at risk. Hydroelectric in particular is at high risk of drought. When the lakes dry up, we no longer have the water pressure to drive hydroelectric power. And suddenly now our citizens don't have power on top of the other problems. Living, homes, factories, stores, roads, the kinds of things that keep our economy going are at risk. So what we're not only proposing that this is our greatest threat, but that we immediately need to look at our building requirements, our regulations, and make sure that our new buildings at least can stand up to this problem. We've had areas that have been inundated by storms, people that have been removed from their homes, and factories that have been wiped out, fields and farms that have been wiped out, that we need to build for the future. And that means we need to look at things like factory farms and bring them inside so that those food sources are secure. We need to make sure our roads can stand up to these climate change events. We need to make sure that our response mechanisms, our EMTs, our first responders can get to areas that are in distress. And they can't do that if there aren't any roads or transport. We need to define our risk at a granular level so our towns, cities, and individuals can begin to plan for it. A lot of these problems can be mitigated if we just have plans in place. Some of our sister cities have put in large water handling facilities so that that when they have a flood, they can move that water and it doesn't wipe out their ability to produce food or areas to live. We need to modify and build our future plans for cities and buildings so that they take into account these risks and that we plan for the future. And we need to identify and mitigate the financial impact of climate change. If we don't have money coming into the country, people aren't paying taxes, and if they aren't paying taxes, we can't fund any of these programs. And if we can't fund those programs, we can't mitigate it. We just get a migration of our population outside of our cities and towns and outside of our country, and no way to build, to serve, to maintain our population. So all of these things need to be in place. So our premise that climate change is the greatest threat facing humanity today is not only supported by the events around us, but it forces us down a path of mitigation that we need to prioritize. I'm not arguing today that we need to move off petrochemicals. That's for another time. At this particular point in time, we are going to be impacted by climate change, and we need to plan for that impact and keep our populations safe, make sure that our support organizations are in place and able to work, and that our food and water is protected, and we are able to maintain our country through these times of change. Mitigating this problem now becomes our primary goal, and that means we have to take it seriously. So our belief is climate change is real. The impacts of climate change are already being felt, and that we need to move aggressively to mitigate those effects in order to survive these changes.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Prime Minister, for your strong views about climate change. I'm sure from the opposition side, they have different strategy and which will be helpful for our audience. Now I request our honorable opposition leaders, Professor David Smith.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to respond to our Prime Minister. Our Prime Minister, as he started his discussion there, began to list many of the other threats. One of them in his first list was the failure of government. And what we saw with the Prime Minister's remarks were not only a failure of government, but we saw the Prime Minister tell us and the members we should put our head in the sand and not worry about it and just kind of listen to what's there. I mean, the Prime Minister made a statement that because we are not a nuclear power, we don't have to worry. Well, I'm sorry, Prime Minister, but let me educate you about nuclear warfare. And, the area around where our country is located is one of the 3 hot zones where the probability of nuclear exchanges is high. And if we have a nuclear exchange in our region, I'm sorry, our country is going to be affected. And it will be affected at a scale that is much greater than we are seeing with our current climate change. Yes, climate change is a longer term issue, which gives us more time to deal with it and gives us more opportunities. And because of climate change being this global challenge, there's more money going to it. But if I'm looking at the greatest threats we have within our country, I'm sorry, but the nuclear warfare exchange is really a big one right around us. You've also talked about ecosystem collapse. Well, we're seeing that possibility too. global climate change is a slower process, and it will take some. And yes, there's changes. There's raising temperature. There's rising sea levels. But we've seen those as trends. And yes, we're higher, but global climate change is cyclical and not nearly as bad as we're seeing some of the other impacts. A nuclear winter, which would come after a nuclear exchange, would affect global climate change much greater than the changes we see happening today. You see that going in. One of the other threats that you fail to mention is this global terrorism activities we're seeing now. And we've seen over time that no nation is exempt from that. We see the impact of uh, airplanes being blown up. We're seeing ground attacks. We're seeing radical people trying to convert our citizens. Uh, Terrorism is a near term close to us. It will kill our citizens. It will help us disrupt our economy if the terrorists are successful. Yes, climate change is very important. I'm not discounting that. But the results are not the immediate catastrophic results we have to our citizens in our country. Um, and one of the challenges we're going to see with global climate change is we're going to see geoengineering being used. And geoengineering is not an exact science. What if we have a geoengineering accident? What if that falls in there in place and creates things that are 100% irreversible? And the other type of things, if you begin to go back and look at the press of the last 2 years, we're seeing major governments around the world talking about encounters with things we do not understand. And Prime Minister, I don't know if you are briefed on the global situation around visitors visiting the Earth from either a asteroid hitting the Earth and causing dramatic change, or a visitor from a more intelligent planet visiting us. Those are going to affect very catastrophic change as well. And those are ones that are unknown. What we see with climate change, as you so adequately told us, is we know a lot about it. We know what we need to do about it. There's a lot of science being applied for it. And we also know the results of it are not immediate. My position, Prime Minister, is there's all these other thoughts, actions are more immediate and can have a greater catastrophic effect on us in our near-term action. And there are things which we can work on and control. But Prime Minister, we really need to not put and bury our heads in the sand on these other issues. And the fact that, because we are not a nuclear country, a nuclear warfare around us would not affect us. I didn't know we had developed a force field that could be deployed around our country and that could protect us from all those impacts. And the environmental impacts of a nuclear exchange far exceed what we see today with the environmental issues we're dealing with. So, Prime Minister, I could go on and list 20 other things as you begin to briefly list other challenges facing us. But we have to be realistic and understand what a nation our size can affect, and the fact that we can be partners with others to address the global change. But in my feeling, it is not the greatest threat we have facing our developing nation. So, Prime Minister, thank you, but I think you were just way off base. Your party's off base. And like I said, clearly from your opening remarks, we have our heads buried in the sand with your party and not representing the interest of our constituencies best in protecting our country, because the basic job of our government is to protect our citizens and provide resources and services to our citizens. And your remarks say, no, I want to be part of this other thing, and I'm neglecting my basic services we need to provide to our constituency. So thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Opposition Leader of the Parliament, for your excellent speech. I believe that our Honorable Prime Minister will take note and he will give guideline for the specific departments, because this is very important national issues. Even not only the developed world, developing worlds, we have to work together, and this Parliament is very important to handle this kind of national issues. Now I request our Honorable Minister of the Parliament, he is expert in climate change, Professor Donald.
Hi. Well, thanks for this opportunity. I'm Minister of the Environment, and so naturally I'm biased about the environment being one of our most important considerations, because we live in it, and if it doesn't work, we're dead. And so I really think that it's something we need to focus on. I want to kind of piggyback a little bit on some of the things that Rob said, and then address a couple of things that David said. And basically, one of the things that the rate at which we're having billion-dollar catastrophes is growing every year, so that we're getting catastrophes that should only happen every 500 years, several times a year. And this rate is just going to continue to accelerate. So it isn't a matter that climate change is something that's in the future. Climate change is causing incredible damage right now. And one of the things that's a little concerning is that there's a glacier in Antarctica called the Thawat Glacier. And the way that glaciers work is that they're on land. Antarctica is land, and big continent, relatively, and very tall mountains. And so around the continent, there's ice has frozen on the water, so that it holds back the glaciers, so that the glaciers don't slip off the mountains and into the water. And one of the one of the ice barriers holding back a glacier called the Thawat Glacier is almost gone, and it'll probably be gone within the next 5 years. And once that's gone, then the Thawat Glacier is going to start slipping into the ocean. And if just that glacier alone slips into the ocean, it'll raise global sea level 2 feet. And 2 feet, it's an interesting thing when the water isn't distributed uniformly. So certain areas wind up having a lot more sea level rise than others. So the east coast of the United States, the sea level is rising much faster than it is at the west coast right now. Though and that's partially because Greenland is melting there. The earth spins, and so water bunches up in one place. Various kinds of things happen. And a lot of what causes sea level rise is that the ocean gets hotter and it expands. And so the currents are warmer on the East Coast than they are on the West Coast. So given all of those things, we are now going to start seeing the sea level rise happen much, much more quickly than it has been. I want to go back to the number of disasters that are $1 billion or more disasters, and point out that the number has to do with the United States, because when the United States has a disaster, the United States has such expensive infrastructure that a disaster that could be much worse here in our country than it would be in the United States, and it wouldn't cost $1 billion because we don't have as expensive of infrastructure yet. So you can't really compare. Everywhere in the world is starting to have these problems. This year, again, we had one of the hottest years, the third hottest year ever in history. And so the last 10 years have been the 10 hottest years ever on Earth. And so climate change is here. And so how is it going to affect us? And sea level rise is one problem. Another problem is heat, because we're getting to the point where some places are so hot that people can't inhabit them. I mean, they live under air-conditioned circumstances, but it requires a lot of energy. And if they can't go outside, if the air conditioners break down, it kills them because it's too hot. And so as Rob pointed out, people are going to have to leave. They're going to have to leave from where they're living, and they're going to have to go someplace else. And another consequence of this is that our food supply is in danger, because we count on weather to be a certain way in order for us to grow crops. And if the crops are unavailable, our food supply goes away or gets reduced, and that will cause people to move, and it will cause wars, and it will cause people to all kinds of problems. And I'm going to list one other thing that talk about the oceans. And Rob mentioned the carbon dioxide. Basically, when carbon dioxide gets absorbed in the ocean, it creates an acid called carbolic acid, which erodes reefs, any kind of animal that has a shell, because it's an acid, and it dissolves the shell. And that's happening to such an incredible degree that the ecosystem of the ocean is changing. And the one creature that is really benefiting from this is jellyfish. And for tens of millions of years or more, the dominant species in the ocean was jellyfish. And over time, other species developed that ate jellyfish, and they managed to come up with a balance where jellyfish were there, but somebody else would eat them, and they'd kind of compete for resources. But now the things that eat the jellyfish are all dying off, and so we're going to have to get to learn to like to eat jellyfish, because and that's another problem with food. So what I'm saying right now is, and then I want to say one other thing, which is that I read an article just a couple of days ago where it was arguing that one of the biggest mistakes that people are making is economists. Economists are predicting that there will only be this minor drop in GDP, and they're looking at the wrong thing. They're looking at weather and not climate. So they're calculating weather events and trying to figure out what's going to happen from that, and projecting these minor drops in GDP. But in fact, with climate, I mean, all the weather changes. So it's going to cause us to have to move. We're going to have to move our cities away from the ocean. The scale of the disruption is incomprehensible. And even though it's incomprehensible, that doesn't mean we shouldn't start trying to comprehend it and mitigating it and doing the things we need to do so that we can be safe and provide a future for our citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Donald, for your excellent views about climate change. Now I request from the opposition side, opposition deputy leader of the parliament, Mr. Jason.
I find it very odd to be on the opposition of this issue, but I almost couldn't help it, because the House is in the affirmative, which means that the House to win should need to have to prove that climate change, one existential risk, is greater than all the rest. And my point is not to disagree with you. I agree with everything you say. And we should probably, after this call, get right on fixing it. But I don't know if it's the biggest. Might be the most important that we should work on right now. But whether it's bigger risk than all the rest, I don't know if that's totally true, because there's a lot of them. And people are awesome. Transhumanists are awesome. We fix stuff. We'll find, once we're aware of a problem and get motivated, we can usually do something about it. There's all kinds of brilliant people. What I'm more worried about is when some of these existential risks happen like one after another. That seems to, in history, tend to be the times when a whole civilizational collapse, when there's seems to take more than just one thing. It takes multiple things hitting them at the same time, and that's kind of what I worry about most, I would think. But for the judges, if there's judges out there somewhere, I just wanted to remember that they got to prove the one is bigger than all the rest. So that's it. Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Jason. Now I request from the government side, Parliament members, Mr. Marshall. Can you unmute, Mr. Marshall?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Whoa. Reverb.
Mr. Marshall, can you hear me? You unmuted. Can you unmute?
That was weird. Did that ever happen before?
Yeah, feedback. It's feedback between the mic and the speakers.
Wow.
So it does happen from time to time.
Okay. Mr. Marshall? Can you
His
unmute,
lips are
please?
moving, but nothing's coming out. He muted his speakers too.
He still shows us muted.
Yeah, he's still muted, but he may have muted his speakers so he can't hear us.
I shut you down.
Oh, Mr. Prime Minister, this clearly shows that the technology approaches from your party just aren't working.
I'm pretty sure the solution was funded by the opposition party. Okay. He's back.
Mr. Marshall, can you hear me? Mr. Marshall?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, can you?
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I don't know what's going on, but I told you I was having problems with my internet today, but here it is. So it's part of climate change, by the way, folks. Just kidding. I've heard the opposition, very interesting comments by the Honorable David Smith and the Honorable Jason Geringer, and our side is taking the position that climate change is real and it's immediate, it's imminent, and we need to do something about it. We ourselves, our country, cannot do anything significant about it compared to the world together. I mean, at the COP26 conference, people were disappointed in governments being able to step up to the plate. So, contrary to popular opinion, science is not divided on the issue of climate change. I know a lot of people think it is. The overwhelming majority, that's 97% of scientists, agree that global warming is real and that it's largely caused by human activity. And yet, we seem to be experiencing record-breaking cold winters. In January 2019, a polar vortex plunged parts of North America into Arctic conditions. In fact, the Honorable David Smith, who I believe was in Texas when that occurred. Here, I am currently on the Hudson River in just north of New York City, and we're about to get a 17 inches of snow. So how does that affect global warming? Well, weather refers to the short-term conditions of the lower atmosphere, such as precipitation, temperature, humidity, wind direction, wind speed, and atmospheric pressure. It could be sunny, cloudy, rainy, foggy, cold, hot, windy, stormy, snowing, the list goes on. The sun drives different types of weather by heating air in the lower atmosphere at varying rates. And warm air rises and cold air rushes in to fill its place, causing wind. These winds, along with water vapor in the air, influence the formation and movement of clouds, precipitation, and storms. That's weather. Climate change is the long-term approach to what's happening on the Earth. And we scientists know that in the long term, climate change is driving, as my fellow legislator, the Honorable Donald Stanley, pointed out, that it's pronounced, by the way, the Thwaites Glacier. The Thwaites Glacier is melting, and it's the canary in the coal mine, whether you like it or not. If you want to believe 2 + 2 = 3, honorable opposition, that's your prerogative. We're in a free country. You can believe that. Doesn't make it so. But 2 + 2 is 4. And in this case, 2 + 2 = 4 means that the Thwaites Glacier is melting. And it's not going to add 2 feet of water. It's going to add 2 meters of water to the planet. And just so you know, in New York City, south of me, is Wall Street. At Wall Street and Pine, where the New York Stock Exchange resides, it's on bedrock, but it's only half a meter above water. That means you're going to need a gondola to get to work, fellow Wall Street. Well, they're not my fellow Wall Streeters, but Wall Streeters are going to have to get a gondola to get there, or motorboats. That's a problem. And by the way, there are 3 other glaciers behind the Thwaites Glacier that are barriers to the South Pole. They are melting too. And the scientists predict, based on scientific data and satellite imagery that I've actually seen, we are going to end up with 20 meters of water on the planet. Now, what does that mean? That means if you don't think this is a crisis now, and you think the greater crisis is nuclear war, we've been confronted with nuclear war since I was a child in the 1950s and 60s. I mean, give me a break. Now, I know Putin's out there threatening Ukraine and all sorts of things. We could end up in nuclear war. But the Iranians are looking towards nuclear devices. But the point is, right now, whether we nuke each other or not, the climate crisis is here. And the point is that as the climate crisis expands and accelerates, and it's an exponential curve, most people don't understand exponential math. They understand a linear curve. This is an exponential curve. And what's happening now is that we know that by 2030, we're going to have 200 million climate migrants, who some of them are going to show up on our shores. And we need to address that. Already, we see what happens politically when 1.2 to 1.3 million climate migrants try to go across the Mediterranean from Africa into Southern Europe. We see what happens in the southern United States when 10,000 Guatemalan children cross the border into Texas and California and New Mexico, and the government, the previous government and the current opposition government gets all bent out of shape about that. What are they going to do when we get to 200 million? Give me a break. Wake up. Time is of the essence. There is no time left. And by the way, there is a climate clock, as I pointed out in previous sessions in our parliament. There's a climate clock in New York City at 14th Street, which is not Times Square that counted down New Year's. It's the one that counts down the climate clock. And basically, we have less than 7 years before we hit these 200 million climate migrants. And by the way, it's already happening. In Indonesia alone, cities are going underwater. Now, what's causing that? That didn't occur because, the weather changed. It's a climate crisis over the past 100 to 200 years of industrial development by mankind. Now, true, our country wasn't around in terms of the climate, developing the climate crisis, but we contributed to it along with everybody else. But the point is, if we want to save our population and our people, we need to act now. What can we do? We have specific missions that we can do. We know that there's technologies out there that we can get in place, and our bank, our developed banks and our other financial institutions don't have to pay for it, but they can act as the guarantors on it so that other folks will pay for it because it's the right thing to do, and they're doing it already. The climate bond in Europe is a classic example of this. We can take advantage of that. Sure, it's not our money. It's investors from pension funds and other institutions around the world that are investing in these climate bonds. Why are they doing it? And by the way, it's the only green bond that is rated by Fitch, Moody's, and Morningstar. Why is that? Because the taxonomies are stringent. What is the taxonomy? It's the rules of the road. You can't greenwash. You can't BS people. So you need to act now. So my point is that if we want to save our country, our people, create greater volume of jobs and security, but at the same token, environmental security, which is a greater threat than nuclear bombs, in my humble opinion, then I think we need to act now. And if we don't act now, the opposition and us will not only be out of jobs, our people will be out of places to live. We need to act now. I rest my case.
Thank you. Thank you, honorable speakers of the parliament. You bring very important point, and which is also important for the developing world, especially Indonesia. Yes, they have a lot of challenges. Now I request Professor David Smith. Definitely he will get around 9 minutes because one of his parliament member is absent, as well as for rebuttals. Professor David Smith.
I have enjoyed listening to the majority speak today, and I've really reflected back up on their premise that climate change is the greatest threat facing humanity today. And I agree. Climate change is a massive threat that we have to deal with today. But the reality is we have time to deal with it today. If we have enlightened leadership in our parliament and elect people who do not stick their heads in the sand and ignore the other global issues, our country has time to do what we can do and to be a partner in the global change going to deal with this. To effectively deal with climate change, it's going to take 192 nations working in concert to really solve all of the elements of climate change. But what the Prime Minister also failed to mention is that if you look at the studies in the area of climate change, a recent study said that 20 companies contribute 70% of the greenhouse emissions into climate change. And unfortunately, none of those 20 companies are in our jurisdiction. Many of them are nation state-owned companies. And for us to deal with this, we need to look beyond our borders, beyond what we as our own country can do, and put our role in a partnership to address it. And we can work diplomatically to do that. We can work using our economy. We can work even with choosing the companies we deal with so that we're not dealing with the list of those companies. The top company on that list is from Saudi Arabia. The third one on the list is from China. Then we have Iranian company is the next one on the list. Then Royal Dutch Shell, then Pemex, then Petroleum Venezuela. After that's Petroleum China. So we will need to work with understanding those environments as well, which is really beyond what our country and our parliament can do today. I spoke earlier about terrorism, and just looking at the amount of terrorism happening around us. Is it as large as climate change? No. But when it happens, it's dramatic, and we can do that. Our prime minister has ignored the pandemic effects in his opening remarks. And, the pandemic is affecting us at a global nation. And, we still have that impacting our citizens every day. Our ability to import other material, the logistics is being affected by elements like this. Climate change is there, but we have time to begin to deal with it. The changes is there. Yes, we have warning signs, but it's very clear by the programs we've had, by the activities, by the briefings, by the intense news coverage and activities like the COP, which Member Marshall mentioned. There's action being done to address climate change. We need to remember that we can be part of the global activities, but the job of our parliament is also to act locally and to protect ourselves locally. And we need to, as your representatives, understand that and to use this as a way to understand what we're doing and put those partnerships really in place. As we look at the elements we're facing and look at the new technologies coming in place, technology is going to help us as we look at the climate change. But when I look at particularly third world nations and developing nations, and in fact, even the large nations, a lot of what we're seeing there is people issues as well, human issues there as well. And we need to understand how to put the will behind, that the 70% polluters, top polluters, are all corporations run by humans. And we have to get this into it as well. We need to understand the impact that we're having on it. Member Marshall dismissed the fact of global conflict that could lead to nuclear war. When if you go and look at he mentioned the climate change clock. He goes and looks at the nuclear war clock. We are actually today seconds away from midnight on that clock. So the risk is high, and particularly the risk in our region. We just had one of our leading nuclear players say that I now have hypersonic weapons that I can use to deliver the threat to our country, even, and to the countries around us. We're seeing other players who have just launched solid stage rockets to put satellites in space who are small nuclear players in the Middle East. And their recent launch has the range to impact our country. That, with their terrorism, I believe is a greater immediate threat to us today than we see with climate change, which I do want to admit is a grand challenge for our nation. But is it the greatest threat? I don't believe it is at this time, because we are a player that can help influence it. We cannot change it ourselves. And, I want to make sure that as we look that we're part of the solution and help drive that solution. But we need to realize that these other threats are much greater to us and our immediate well-being, and they are threats that we cannot control. They're threats that we are not part of. We do not have an anti-missile system to help us. I cannot control the trade winds if there's a nuclear exchange. I cannot control where radiation goes. I cannot control the nuclear winter, which makes climate change look like a walk in the park. So there are these other threats too. But global climate change is a threat. but is not the greatest threat we face. And as I work with our citizens and our constituencies, we really need to understand to help them across the board be part of the global community dealing with climate change, but also understand these other threats that face our great nation. And, it's clear to me the ruling party doesn't get it. By positioning themselves as the climate change, it's clear they're working with other constituencies outside our country. Who knows? Maybe even they're lining their pockets with money from them as they look at that side. Maybe we need to do an investigation and have a special commission put in place to really understand them ignoring the direct threats to our citizens and looking at this global threat, which we're such a small player, and elevating it to that region. So I believe we have other actions coming out of this. Yes, it's a big threat, but it's not the greatest threat. And it's one that we as a parliament need to understand all the elements around it and where the other influences are coming into play. So appreciate the time to speak back on this and really deal with this very important issue. But as I examine our region, we have more imminent threats than climate change. Again, it is a big threat, but it is not the greatest threat that we face. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Opposition Leader of the Parliament. I believe Honorable Prime Minister for this Parliament, in his closing speech, he can give us specific direction, but definitely Professor David Smith, as the Opposition Leader, he actually bring very important point, and I believe government of this Parliament, they should take necessary initiative because Professor David Smith brings some interesting point which will be relevant for this parliament, and we take it note. Definitely in the futures, we want to do more debate which one will be the biggest crisis for the developing world. Now I request our Honorable Prime Minister of the Parliament, Professor Rob Enderle, and he will go for his closing remarks for today's session.
The opposition has made some rather interesting arguments. One, they've argued that we should be more worried about extraterrestrials than we are about climate change. Another is we should be more worried about nuclear war than we are about climate change, even though nuclear war would result in the same kind of climate events we're trying to protect against, and with the only difference being they would happen more quickly. He suggested that we instead put our efforts in developing a force field system to stop nuclear weapons. The U.S. military has been working on one of those for decades. It's called the active denial system. It doesn't work. He argues that we really shouldn't worry about climate change because we really can't do anything about it. We're a small country. None of the 20 companies that he identified are in our borders. And then he pointed out that we really can't do anything about nuclear war either. So it looks like the opposition's approach to these problems is let's not do anything because either we can't do anything or it's not a problem today. Let's let tomorrow worry about it. We're seeing the effects of climate change today. That one of the other areas he'd like us to focus on are global terrorism. And it's a problem of about $26 billion worldwide every year. The issue, of course, is that global climate change is a $551 trillion problem for us every year. So I would argue the opposition has its priorities upside down. And as we look at global climate change, it does create an increase of violence. People are fighting over resources. So the problems like nuclear war and global terrorism are exacerbated by climate change. They are subordinate to it. They're not a superset. We mentioned before that one of the big issues we're dealing with are atmospheric rivers, the ability to drop tons of water on an area that's ill prepared for it. Our administration argues that we don't want to put our head in the sand. We need to start dealing with these problems now. I would agree with the opposition that correcting climate change is beyond our capability and purview, just like trying to stop nuclear war is beyond our capability and purview. We do not have the tools or the capabilities to do that, but we do have the tools and the capabilities to mitigate the impact of climate change. We can build our houses stronger. We can build them higher. We can secure our factories. We can secure our food sources. We can secure our water supplies. We can make sure that our citizens, and I agree again with the opposition, that our predominant goal is to protect those citizens. We can't protect those citizens if we do nothing. If we just continue to raise our hands and say, hey, it's too big for us. We can't do this. It's beyond our capabilities. Government would have therefore abdicated its responsibility and not done anything. Granted, if you want that as an outcome, certainly vote for the opposition, because they have clearly stated that they plan to do nothing about this problem, even though they admit it is a big problem, because it's off into our future. Even though our citizens are homeless because of floods, our people are migrating out of the countries because of violence and famine, and we've got major movements of goods and services that have been held up because of logistics problems, all impacted to a certain degree by climate change. Jason pointed out a concern with regard to cascading risks. That's a big concern. The idea that a nuclear war could cause climate change, and then the climate change hits, and then we have pestilence, and we have disease. But we've got to mitigate these things regardless of the source. So that at the end of the day, what we have to do is we have to get ahead of this problem. We have to protect our citizens. We can't put our head in the sand and say it's going to happen in the future. We can't run around being scared of aliens. We need to deal with the problems that we have today. The problems, they're right in our face, and we need to make sure our citizens are safe, our energy sources are safe, our food supplies are safe, and that we're prepared for tomorrow. Otherwise, we may not have a country. Our citizens will migrate to countries that are better prepared. Those that are left will be starving and unable to pay taxes, and whoever is in government will probably be exited from government in an extreme and violent fashion, and we don't want that even for our opposition. So in the end, climate change is the biggest problem we have in front of us today. It impacts every aspect of our country. We may not be able to stop climate change, but we certainly can mitigate it, and it should be our top priority. The Parliament rests.
Thank you, Honorable Prime Minister, for your excellent speech, and I believe that the audience, because we already share hundreds of different groups, including Harvard debate clubs, World University Debating Unions, World University Debating Championships, Oxford Union, and the Cambridge Union, and on social media we share. So our audience can give feedback. The audience will decide who will be the winner for today's debate, but next week definitely we have debate. And beside that, I just want to add that this is mock parliament. We just want to create a great example how the developing worlds in the parliament, they can do debate. Why knowledge is very important? Because all of our parliament members, they are highly knowledgeable in their area and they can contribute. So this is one of the major aspects of World Talent Economy Forum, because if we want to change the developing world, we need to develop a better parliaments. We need to develop a better policymakers, and definitely we need highly educated parliament member like today's session. And we want to welcome all of our parliament members in our parliament in the futures. And we have planned, we want to arrange debate in the unions, because unions, there are thousands of students engaged and they can join as an audience. Because of the COVID, we cannot arrange right now, but in the future, definitely we will arrange. Previously, we arranged program with the Oxford University and the Cambridge University. Hope after the pandemic, we can arrange same kind of things. And beside that, I want to give special thanks to our speakers, because how you go for speech and debate, it's like a real parliament. It's like a real speech, and definitely in the parliament we should invite this kind of debaters, because they can add interesting views from their area, and maybe in the futures today's speaker, they will join in the politics and they will go and join in the parliament as well. This is also possible because we get a huge response. Many of our students, youth community, they want speakers like you in the parliament, because you people are creating great example for World Talent Economy Forum. Thank you for your excellent speech. Thanks everyone, Mr. Marshall, Professor Rob, Professor Donalds, Professor David Smith, Mr. Jason, for your I want to give thanks for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. We will arrange more debates. We will arrange debate in between AI and human. Beside that, we want to arrange corporate debate. Maybe the Professor Rob Enderley from Enderley Group bring teams. Professor David Smith can bring teams from ETT. Mr. Marshall bring teams from advanced resilient technologies. Transhumanist Point bring another teams. David Smith, Professor Donald can bring another team. These are the way we want to arrange a debate tournaments, because this debate ultimately a art for learning, art for knowledge delivery, art for argument, art for open dialogue. So we want to arrange more session like today's session. And thank you everyone for your excellent speech and excellent contributions. Thank you, Professor Rob, Mr. Jason, Professor David Smith, Professor Donalds, and Mr. Marshall. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.